Thank you, Gordon, for that introduction, and thanks to all the organizers of this event for inviting me and for all of the arrangements leading to it, especially Emily, who was extremely patient, trying to organize an almost impossible itinerary from Boston to Ottawa, not apparently the world's easiest connection. Anyway, it is, having watched this network or cluster of activities come into being, it's a great pleasure to be here at another moment in its evolution. And I hope to address some of the kinds of issues that you've been talking about. Your story about integrative versus reductionist ecology calls attention to the fact that my last slide actually is full of questions. So I'm not even going to give answers, whether they're relevant or irrelevant, but maybe that'll be a jumping off point for thinking about some other sorts of things. So at least south of the border, and to some extent, I gather, also in Canada, there's a widespread perception that science and technology are in trouble in some way, that they are under attack in ways that are unprecedented. Of course, you seem to be living through the George W. Bush years in some respects here in Canada. I had always thought that Canada was far too sensible a society to ever allow itself to be dragged in the directions that America periodically gets dragged into. But there we are, and one's political predictions are never reliable. So where does one begin to address this question of whether science is in trouble and how we would even know it? So in particularly Anglo-American countries, and to some degree in the European Union as well, there's a fetish for doing surveys about what it is that people think about science. It's a little bit like, what do people think about Miley Cyrus and things like that. On all the kinds of indicators that are produced, it turns out that science does not look to be in trouble, depending on where you look. So the British Public Survey Organization, Ipsos Mori, has done reports periodically on the public appreciation of science. And from their last report, which was their fourth report, there's this kind of diagram that, this is the latest version in showing weighted averages of preferences for various things, so that 80% you see on the top is 80% agree on the whole science will make our lives easier, and down below you see an even larger number on the bottom right, 82% agree scientists want to make life better for the average person. So it's nice that people think that both in terms of what scientists want and what they actually are likely to achieve, people have a high degree of confidence. 88% agree scientists make a valuable contribution to society. So these are not numbers that are consistent with claims that science is in trouble in some way. And scientists themselves enjoy a very high degree of regard. So when they've started measuring not just what people think about science, but what they think about scientists, for each of the statements, please could you tell me the extent to which you agree or disagree, the top line is percentage who agree scientists make a valuable contribution to society, and that has stayed relatively constant. As you see, if anything, in 2011, it's mildly higher than it was in 2005. And agree scientists want to make life better for the average person. Note, this is the average person, so it relates to ideas about citizen science, which you heard about last night, I gather. So, there 82% agree that scientists want to make life better for the average person. So it's not that the out-of-control guy or gal in the lab coat who's sort of releasing dangers into the world. That is not the going image of science or scientists in these kinds of polls. And that's for the UK. If you turn to the US, the standard place to turn is the National Science Foundation's Science and Engineering Indicators, and there's the famous Chapter 7, which is about the public understanding of science. And then from the 2012 Science and Engineering Indicators and the executive summary of that document, you see various statements that are, again, consistent with a high degree of interest in and support for science. So Americans have consistently expressed interest in S&T, with 41% reporting they were very interested, 50% reporting they were moderately interested. Well, if you add up those numbers, that's quite a lot of people. Americans in all demographic groups consistently endorse the past achievements and future promise of S&T. So there's both hero worship of past scientists and promises of the future. Support for government funding of scientific research remains strong. Now, this is something that scientists themselves are always going on about, that the miserable state of public understanding of science undercuts support for the public understanding, for the funding of science, and so on and so forth. This is Dan Greenberg, the famous Washington journalist who covered science and technology for a very long time, wrote in his book about this myth, that there is just no correlation, and yet scientists keep on acting as if there is a correlation between what they take to be public misunderstanding of science and what they take to be lack of support of funding for scientific research. There just isn't evidence, and when you talk about evidence-based opinion, it is a little bit shocking to me that members of the science and engineering communities keep on reiterating these views when, in fact, the survey research, which they themselves like to rely on for other purposes, indicates very little in the way of a correlation there. And a majority of Americans accord scientists very great prestige. Ratings for engineers, some of you may wish to take this on board, are lower, but nonetheless better than for most other occupations. And as you know, those occupations these days include being an elected representative of the American people to the Congress of the United States. So, you know, scientists and science are doing a lot better. So why the worries? Well, these same indicators begin to offer maybe a slight glimpse or window into the answers. So here's one cautionary note. From that same list of what the majority of Americans believe and don't believe. So a majority of Americans favor medical research that uses human embryonic stem cells. However, Americans are overwhelmingly opposed to reproductive cloning and wary of innovations using cloning technology. Well, as you know, this has been a starting point for mobilization among life scientists to some degree, pointing out that the reason that the public gets worried about these things is that they're speaking in the wrong terminology, that they should not actually be saying things like cloning technology. There isn't any such thing. If you really were a life scientist, you would speak in other terms. And if scientists could only dictate the terms of the debate, the actual language, instead of these fearsome phrases that people coin for themselves or that the media regurgitate, like cloning technology, then we would be home free. And because people don't get the specialist language, which is what scientists want to put in their mouths, therefore you get misunderstanding. So already in a statement like this, you begin to see some of the underlying fissures and fracturations of the surface agreement between scientists' needs and desires and the public's needs and desires with regard to science. This, I think, is an interesting other survey from the Pew Research Center, again reported very recently in 2013. So this is, the reason I think this is interesting is that the place above all where Americans are, US Americans are strongly supportive of funding for research and research itself is in the life sciences and technologies. And why? In part because of lengthening of life. When you hear sort of standard speeches praising the achievements of science and technology, increasing longevity is almost all the time one of those achievements that people point to. So here is a place where people were asked about biomedical advances that would produce greater longevity. And they were asked whether they personally want medical treatments that allow the average person to live decades longer, to at least 120 years. And then they were asked, what do they think most people would prefer? And there's an interesting asymmetry there between the two things. So they personally the majority of people, 56%, would not want themselves to live 120 years. But they think most people would want to live 120 years. I mean, so 68% attribute to other people a desire that they don't themselves have. So you see there a kind of ambivalence. And the quality of ambivalence, of course, is not well measured in survey instruments. I think that one of the analytic tasks for people who are engaged in science and society activities is to understand the nature of ambivalence better and to understand what in a multivalence kind of world accounts for ambivalence in people's attitudes to things. And then here is a diagram, another graph, that is more concerning perhaps than anything else I've shown you so far. So this is, through 2010, a mapping of people's political positions in the US and their level of trust in science. So the topmost graph is people who consider themselves political liberals. And you see, if anything, a slight upward trend since 2002. So again, you can sort of wonder about why that is. But those are the years in which the huge politicization of science happened in the George W. Bush administration. The middle one is, which shows a downward trend, is moderate political, the political moderates are the triangle in the bottom, and the conservatives show that steep downward trend in the middle. So conservatives and moderates are both trending down toward virtually the same kinds of levels of distrust, having started at similar starting points back in 1974, which is not all that long ago. And now they're wide apart by quite a number of percentage points with regard to the variable of trust in science. So what's going on there? Why this gap? And of course, scientists and engineers and the leaders of the scientific community have a ready answer. They call it public lack of understanding in science. They call it media-driven distortions of the scientific evidence. And so the attribution is to non-right thinking among people. So clearly the first graph, the topmost one, is the one that would be the right one if people understood science as scientists would like science to be understood. All right, so all of this is based on a set of assumptions, and what I want to do for the remainder of my talk is to question some of those assumptions based on cases that are widely known in this audience and in the public in general, but I want to present a somewhat different reading of some of these cases. All right, so trust in science and trust in scientists. You know, science is a very big domain. Even ecology, as we heard, has people approaching ecological science from different perspectives. STS people like to think a lot about the actual work that goes into doing ecology, for instance, and somebody who studies a field site and goes back to that same plot of land over and over again every year is doing a different thing in work terms, in attachment terms, in analytic terms, from somebody who's doing remote sensing using satellite-based data, surveying large swaths of territory, and yet all of this can be ecology, and you can study one species and still be an ecologist. So, you know, science is a wide variety of things, and when we say science, I think we have to get a little bit more down and dirty about what we are talking about. So with regard to climate science, we're usually talking about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the body that has pulled together the most authoritative statements about climate science in known human history. And one can therefore ask why people should trust them. And there are only a couple of thousand of them. And in any case, who is a climate scientist is a post hoc achievement in a sense. You know climate scientists because they get roped into writing the IPCC reports, not because there are climate scientists out there whom you can identify using a Geiger counter and they are the climate scientists of the world, right? So why should we trust them? So there are different theories for why we should trust them, corresponding broadly to theories about the validation of science in general. The first one, which is often called truth to nature, is that well, we should trust them because they're depicting reality. But as everybody knows, there is a question about the kind of data being used and what are signals and what's noise, and you have to try to understand how much convergence is enough convergence to show that what we're getting now is a true signal and not noise. And there's always going to be interpretive flexibility. And even if you agree that a phenomenon like this is happening, there are many, many, many uncertainties about how much, when, in what places, to what degrees, affecting what pieces of the weather system. Even within the short history of climate science, we've actually gone through a major name change from global warming to climate science, and we've gone through an understanding that it was a rise in the mean temperature around the Earth, which is what global warming implied, to something that says it's much more erratic, much more situated, that in a city like Boston, you may end up getting a very cold spring, and yet the overall temperature of the Earth may be rising, and extreme events is what we should care about. And new discourse has entered the vocabulary of climate scientists themselves. So this question of the reality to which climate science corresponds is complicated and not straightforward, not linear, not achieving the kind of convergence towards a singular truth that many people expect of science, and which scientists, by the way, think the public ought to believe about science to a great extent. What about a different kind of more sociological reason why we should trust these climate scientists? The great sociologist of science, Robert Merton, in the middle of the 20th century, posited that one reason to trust scientists was that their mode of work promotes trust, that they are themselves honest to a degree that is not seen in other social institutions, not because they're virtuous people, but because their stock in trade depends on their being honest in some sense. But it turns out that it's very difficult to find disinterested scientists these days. Science needs money to support it, and it doesn't matter, in a sense, whether the money is coming from government or the money is coming from industry. There is interest all around. My much respected good friend, climate scientists, do hang out with pretty important people. And, you know, there is a kind of cachet that comes from sitting on the President's Scientific Advisory Committee that does not come from, say, sitting in this room on a morning in Ottawa. I mean, you know, there are stakes and rewards. There's a reward structure, there's a ladder, you climb that, there are interests. It is not a value-free domain, no matter what people tell you. You get to go on cruises to Antarctica, and you go to Aruba to have meetings to discuss things. I mean, you know, these are things that would strike that same average person who believes that scientists have a lot of prestige as living a lifestyle that few average people have in them the capacity to live. Moreover, it's not universal in the sense that Robert Merton claimed about science, because we're talking about an interdisciplinary domain with very different styles of measuring things, monitoring things, representing things. The work products that go into making climate science are hugely disparate, and so on and so forth. So some people think that it's not just correspondence to nature to some degree, not just scientific integrity to some degree, but the strength of the consensus. If this were false, you would get more disagreement. But consensus can come about for all sorts of reasons. Some of you in this room may be old enough to remember the horrible story of Jonestown in South America, where close to 1,000 people committed suicide following a cult leader. Cults happen. They happen within science as well as outside of science. Epistemic community is the nice name we give to a set set of people who end up believing the same thing. But the fact is there is resonance, positive resonance and feedback when you're in a community and wishing to believe a set of things. And the extent to which this plays back into one's unwillingness to hear dissenting opinion is something that needs to be taken account of as well. If you're working in a community, you're not making entirely independent judgments. So last but not irrelevant is that this is the closest thing to democratic scientific development that we can think of, because it is not just any old consensus, but a consensus that is representative according to agreed upon norms of representation. It is transparent, again, according to agreed upon norms of transparency. Of course, we have to ask second order questions about who agreed anyway, but nevertheless, this is a different way of justifying it. And it's accountable, again, according to agreed upon rules for how you ensure accountability through wide peer review and wide accountability to the public. So it will not surprise you to learn that I, with my training in law and to some degree public policy and regulation, believe that the democratic virtues part of it is extremely important. And if anything, that is the piece that I would key my own set of trust feelings upon, not just the other three, which is not to say that I consider the other three irrelevant. I just think the other three, the top three, are not meaningful for public science used for public purposes unless it also corresponds to the democratic virtues. So this is not the argument that one hears climate scientists giving for themselves. And in that respect, I think they're acting to some degree as their own enemy. Climate scientists themselves prefer the argumentation that it is all about truth to nature and it's all about the strength of the consensus. And here are references to some famous articles and famous writings that reinforce exactly that view. Now, if you think that it's the truth value and the consensus that justify our trust in science, then you have a theory of why dissent happens. And it's very easy to claim that dissent happens because of corruption. And this is a book that has become extremely famous, and what it portrays is people buying science for their own purposes. Here are the authors. The lady on the right is Naomi Oreskes, and the gentleman is Eric Conway. And it is a sign of the potency of the book that Naomi Oreskes, as of this fall, is a professor at Harvard. And the book has been extremely influential. In fact, somebody sent me a link to an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that you can look up today, an article about how defender of climate science comes to Harvard. Okay, so defender of climate science, but I'm not interested in whether somebody is a defender of climate science or not. I am interested in why we should trust a set of predictions about the future of the Earth that will affect every single person in this room and for generations to come. That, I think, is worthy of high stakes, not whether we trust climate science or not. That is a surrogate measure. But I'm much more interested in the why question about trust. Why should we trust them? And I don't think that a good answer is that dissenting opinion has been bought by corporations, even if the evidence is strong that corporations buy science to suit their interests. So I am not denying that there is corporate corruption in the making of knowledge. It's just that that is not the full story. So ClimateGate taught us to be a little bit skeptical of the buying science argument as the be-all, end-all, and the only explanation that we need to worry about. It taught us certain kinds of things about the robustness of the consensus. And I think one thing that we learned is that the story is much more complicated. And the point that I want to make for the rest of the talk is that science is not value-free. It is value-laden in all sorts of profound ways. Not that it should not be value-laden, but in democratic societies, we need to, indeed in any societies, we need to understand what that value-ladenness consists of and where we, the people, have to have some say in the values that are incorporated into the very doing and propagating of science. So climate science does not only state that a certain set of greenhouse gas-induced changes in climate are going to happen. They also force us to think about the future in radically different terms from the ways in which humanity has thought about the future for a very long time. And I call attention to the shift in scale making as one of these ways. If you go through the scales at which we think about our environment and the future, climate science in and of itself, through the kinds of claims it's making, is forcing us to turn our gaze to a different scalar dimension. So with regard to nature, weather has become climate. It's the easiest thing to understand, where we're being forced to consider changes in what's happening in weather, which still concern us, by the way. It's not that we can forget about the weather. I had to make a concerted decision about whether I would stick my umbrella into my bag when I left Boston on a sunny morning, and I looked up Ottawa, and they gave me a misleading report that it was going to be raining, and I did bring the umbrella, and every ounce counts when you're traveling by air. So, I mean, so local weather does matter. But at the same time, we're forced to look at this and say, oh, it's a warm fall, what's happening, and it's also climate. Space, it's no longer sufficient to be talking about geopolitics in older terms that were current for 200 years. It's supranational. Time, this is very, very important. Most people don't think in terms of far distant futures. And the very important science of economics has conditioned us to say what happens 10 years out, let alone 100 years out, is irrelevant. We're going to discount it. So here is a science extremely powerful in public policy that's telling us we should not bother thinking about the future a certain number of decades ahead. And then here is natural science saying you must think about that future hundreds of years ahead. So between economics and climate science, there is a disruption, both equally scientific, both equally relevant to policy, about the way in which you should think about time. So pity us poor average persons who are supposed to ask ourselves the question, what is the temporality that we should be thinking in and thinking of? This is not a joke. I mean, sometimes with time, I show the picture of Stonehenge to suggest that this is one of the oldest recorded artifacts of human creativity, and it's only about 5,000 years old, and we have no clue what that thing meant. And yet, here's Sandia National Labs commissioning from people around the country statements about how to warn people about nuclear waste at 10,000 years hence. I mean, there's a sort of perverseness almost about forcing people to think in these kinds of terms. What about people themselves? Lots of psychological experiments show that we are more attuned to people close to us than to people distant from us, and yet here we're being asked to take over stewardship for unborn generations and for the whole population of the earth. And last but not least, the scale of governance. Subsidiarity, the principle of subsidiarity, which is a piece of all constitutional government, says rule at the place that is closest to the people. In one way or another, this is articulated into many modern constitutions, and yet climate science is saying rule away from the people, thinking globally. Okay, so it does say act locally, but I think there's a bit of a mistake. I mean, if you're thinking globally and acting locally, you're still acting on the global thinking. So it's forcing you to be displaced in a certain sense. So these are things that climate science is asking people to do, and they're not in the domain of is it truth to nature. These are in the domain of values, they're in the domain of governance, they're in the domain of who should care about what. So what climate science and climate governance asks us to do is to buy into what I would refer to as a regime of discontinuities. Our ordinary inherited capacity to imagine the future as being continuous somehow with the present becomes disrupted, and we're asked to think of a future that is actually broken from the present in the kinds of ways that I'm suggesting. There are other disruptions we can no longer afford to if we're real environmentalists. Think of nature as being out there, it has to be part of culture. We can no longer think in terms of humans as the only thing we need to care about, because humans are integrated into an ecosystem, and maybe the most dangerous piece of that ecosystem we're led to believe. We're projecting time beyond the capacities of human remembrance. We're questioning the nation state and its capacity to summon up the expertise to solve problems. And with all of that, we're necessarily challenging the objectivity of science, because science has wrapped up in it all these value dimensions. All right, so that tells a much more complicated story, which the corruption of knowledge line, that narrative, does very little to address these other kinds of concerns. All right, let's turn to another very powerful story that scientists tell about the problems with public trust in science. And this is the story of agricultural biotechnology. All of you have heard of it over at least a decade, if not more. It took particularly virulent form in Britain, but all over Europe there is widespread distrust of agricultural biotech scientists and of crop biotechnology in general. And this is dismissed in the US as a paradigm example of the public not knowing, not understanding science, and therefore rejecting it. However, if you look at a series of outbreaks around crop biotechnology in the United States and look at the explanations that have been offered by the scientific community for these eruptions, as it were, then you see together a packet of stuff that adds up to something like GM denialism, a term that I believe you have never heard of, but this time the shoe is on the other foot, in a sense. So one of the early demonstrations was by a Cornell scientist who showed that the monarch butterfly's larvae suffer from exposure to pollen from genetically modified corn. And this was a good study whose quality nobody has ever challenged. What has been challenged is the relevance of that study to the real world. So industry says, yeah, good study, but it just has no bearing on the actual behavior of monarch butterflies who never come into contact with the GM corn in the way that this study presupposes. The story of Ignacio Chapela and GM maize, in which he claimed that the modified trait was finding its way into native species in Mexico, is another case. This one did bring forth accusations that it was not good science. Each of these stories one could dwell on and talk for 50 minutes about just that, but I won't. The point is to go through the cases and show that each one has dragged forth a separate and different explanation for what went wrong. Starlink and Taco Bell, this is a kind of genetically modified corn that was authorized for use in animal feed, but found its way into tacos of Taco Bell, where it wasn't supposed to be, and that has been dismissed as a case of regulatory failure. Protogene, a case of a pharmaceutical, a nutraceutical plant that ended up in the wrong plot. It wasn't supposed to come back the following year, and yet it did, and that was chalked up to bad agricultural practices. You all know about Percy Schmeiser even better than I do, because this was a Canadian case, and that, it was treated as a case of patent infringement, not accidental cross-contamination of Percy Schmeiser's non-GM crop by Monsanto's GM crop. There's a case involving GM golf course grass, and it escaped out of the golf courses all over the place, but it was treated as not a problem because it actually caused no harm. Now, each of these, you can see, involves an unauthorized release of one sort or another, an escape of the genetically modified variant into places where it shouldn't be. And yet, instead of telling a sort of holistic story about maybe we're wrong to assume that these things cannot be contained and maybe we should be thinking differently, each one has a targeted, specific explanation that's offered from the industrial side. So, you don't have to be a trained lawyer to see this as a case of special pleading, and you may wonder then about, how else this plays out in the world. All right, so on the US side, GM is being treated as something that needs to be propagated all over the world. But for that, you have to construct the rest of the world as needing American science. And this is a powerful image that shows how the rest of the world is being constructed. A lot of these battles are, in fact, playing out in a place called Africa. Now, lest you think that this is a figment of my or a cartoonist's imagination, you can turn to Science magazine, where in 2003, the then head of the Rockefeller Foundation, one of the chief proponents of GM in agriculture, wrote an article, co-authored, talking about Africa's need for GM. And that article features a constructed representative of Africa known as Mrs. Namurunda, who, and it's quoted there, represents a composite of situations existing in Africa. So, you don't need a great deal of post-colonial theory to be a little bit worried about a statement like this and that it's appearing in Science magazine. And you don't need to be a student of the Bible to read here a set of plagues of Egypt, only they're descending on poor Mrs. Namurunda. And then the article in question represents, with tabulations of the improvements wrought upon her crops, a scientific-like demonstration that the need for GM agriculture is strong and that it is all over Africa. So questions that don't get answered, for instance, there's a huge revival of the golden rice debate going on in the media right now. But what doesn't get answered is, why would the things that got in the way of shipping vitamin pills to little children not also get in the way of GM agriculture, especially when we have Nobel Prize-winning work like Amartya Sen's showing that famines are not the product of lack of plenty, they're the product of institutional failure at all levels. So why is it that institutional failure is not presupposed for high-tech agriculture, even though institutional failure runs rampant in all of these places about maintaining a sort of minimal degree of public health protection? So given that, it's not surprising that you get, all kinds of outbursts of opposition, and you get it from scientists. So this was sent to me yesterday, but that's on any day I lecture, I can sort of talk about yesterday's news, and it's relevant. So this was sent to me by, obviously, somebody who is skeptical about GM agriculture, but see what it says. Repeated recent claims of a consensus affirming the safety of GMOs are misleading and, quote, may place human and environmental health at undue risk and create an atmosphere of complacency, states Dr. Angelika Hilbeck, chairperson of the European Network of Scientists for Social and Environmental Responsibility. So these debates are inside of science, and one can dismiss an organization of scientists for social responsibility and say they're bad scientists or they're subject to NGOs or whatever else. But note that that would be an asymmetrical argument, because it would not invoke the fact that a lot of agricultural science is privately funded science paid for by Monsanto, and yet people don't talk about that in the same terms that they talk about the climate science, which is also bought by industry to some extent. All right, I want to finish up with a sort of general set of claims about the universalism of science. So a lot of these kinds of problems of trust rest on a foundation, a shared foundation, which we as children of the Enlightenment share about the universalism of science. And it's well to remember that after World War II, these themes came into play in a very major way, that science was equated with progress, with efficiency. I don't have time to talk about the little post-colon descriptions of what I'm talking about, but Science, the Endless Frontier, the 1945 manifesto of Vannevar Bush, is well known. So progress, efficiency, accessibility, eradication of hunger and disease, and transparency, that we would get cleaner development of all kinds of sorts. This was propagated through the UN as a kind of one world vision, through the expertise of the UN agencies, and it's summed up in this well-known quotation about nuclear power, which symbolizes the era's technocratic confidence. But you will note that some of the themes I'm saying are part of the universalist claims of science are built into this statement. Not too much to expect that our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter. So that electrical energy too cheap to meter is widely known and widely quoted. But Strauss went on to say, he went on to talk about famines. We'll know of great periodic regional famines only as matters of history, about travel, and about longevity. We'll experience a lifespan far longer than ours as disease yields and man comes to understand what causes him to change. So this is a statement about the apolitical nature of science and its capacity to better the human condition, wherever the human condition may be, not just locally, but globally. So that's not how everybody sees it. Strauss was talking about nuclear energy. This is from Germany. The only thing that is certain is risk. And that leads people like me to wonder about the ways through social institutions and processes that different societies construct their images of the future. And this is one of the final things I want to say to you, which I don't have time to get into in detail, but in my current work on sociotechnical imaginaries, what I'm trying to explore is a challenge to the claim of universalism. People do not expect the same things about science and technology, even when they respond the same way to whether scientists have prestige or not across different countries. What they think science is, how they think it ought to enter into their lives, and what particular areas of scientific and technological development ought to do for them. Visions of the public good and how science and technology ought to serve those visions of the public good do vary in interesting ways across cultures. This is from a comparison of nuclear power in the US, South Korea, and Germany. One notices very obvious empirical facts, like Fukushima happens. It has essentially no resonance in South Korea. Germans do yet another flip-flop and decide to phase out their old nuclear power plants, even though nobody thinks Germany is an earthquake-prone region or a tsunami-prone region. And the US is still talking about reviving nuclear power in a clean and controllable way. And so if you look at how these countries differ in their framing of risks and, of course, benefits, and what the stakes are, and how they define and frame public policy, what the nature of controversies is, and what the nature of closures is, you find quite radical and systematic cross-national differences, which suggest that we should not be addressing a thing like trust in science as if it is dislocated, as if it is a universal property of science or a universal property of culture. We have to get more specific, more particular, more localized in addressing our questions, and we can't divorce science from technology either. We have to think of that pairing as if they matter, because science enters most people's lives, not as science, but as technology, as an applied variant of the findings that may correspond in some basic way to natural phenomena. So these are the questions then that I want to end with, as I promised. I'm ending with questions, but the questions in a way are, where should we go next? And so the claim I would make is that over the 400 or so years that we've lived with a gradually increasing in size and scope modern science and its technological dimensions, in effect, we've created a set of unwritten constitutional suppositions about the relationship of science to the state, to the polity, to citizens, and to our lives. And I think the challenge for the coming century, if you will, is to undo some of those presumptions, or at least hold them up to the light of day. I sometimes refer to this as the Second Enlightenment. The First Enlightenment did away with superstitions about nature. Today we have to do away with superstitions about science. And ask, what is this set of unwritten rules that we've crafted? And the answers will be different in different societies. So here are some of the sources of that unwritten power. What kind of authority does science enjoy in relation to other institutions of power? And again, I could give an entire lecture, an entire course about one very specific institution, the US courts, and deal with the answer, the multi-layered answer to this question as between science and the US courts. And one of the challenges for a science and society cluster is to have people who are doing this in every country. So what is that relationship between Canadian science and the Canadian courts? It deserves people to be looking at this in an ongoing way. What are the rules of conduct for science and of political accountability? And believe me, these things vary. Just the rules by which expert advisory committees are formed across countries that are otherwise incredibly similar to one another vary radically across countries. But what interests me is the underlying political theory, the underlying idea of constitutional regularity, governance, accountability, and even democracy that's embedded in these diverse rules for how you get an expert advisory committee to advise the government. What happens when this unwritten norm breaks down? We know from a couple of generations of sociology that not all social rules are written down, and in fact the most powerful rules may be the ones that are not written down. How do you all know that you shouldn't be whispering to one another while I'm talking? I mean, probably nobody actually gave you that rule ever, or that you should somehow be making eye contact towards me and not have your laptops open. I mean, there's a whole, my students, by the way, don't know these things. So, and Jason has been well, inculcated into a different tradition by now. But anyway, he looks at me often enough that I know he's not buying shoes. Anyway, so there are all these unwritten rules. They're part of this unwritten constitutional status of science. And yet it breaks down. So arguably, the way we should be thinking about the GM case and the climate science case is not from an all-knowing position of who is right and who's wrong, and all we need to do is figure out why the benighted people are wrong in this particular case, but rather to treat them as cases of constitutional breakdown, similar to constitutional crises that happen, particularly, something that I, coming from a legalistic culture of the United States, have always found fascinating, is how the UK knows when there is a constitutional crisis, given that they don't actually have a written constitution. So that it's that kind of unwritten rule where people have a sensibility that something seriously is breaking down that I think deserves investigation. So the project that led us to this room, or the projects actually, because now it's a confluence of things, and the hoped for future, this is in part about a perceived constitutional crisis, but I think we have to recognize it, hold it up, shake the dust off, and actually see what the elements of that constitutional crisis are. And then, okay, death of evidence, but, let's realize that evidence itself is constructed to be a thing called evidence. And if you don't believe that, go see Rashomon all over again and wonder what evidence is. And, so these are things that we have to think about. And then, because we can't avoid being a world polity, we can't any longer afford to be parochial. So the constitutional rules governing science-society relations in the United States, just to take the country about which I feel I can speak most authoritatively, those should not necessarily be imported over and overlaid on somebody else's society without examining it. If science really were universal in its own terms, apolitical in its own terms, value-free in its own terms, then okay, we can bump it up to a position of global constitutional governance. But what I hope I've shown you, or at least pointed fingers at, is a whole set of nested arguments for why we should not buy into that surface characterization of the nature of science in relation to the rest of society. Once we've bought into that, it is decades of work. The Second Enlightenment may be a little faster in the era of Twitter than the First Enlightenment was, but nevertheless, it's going to take us a very long time to get to a place where we can buy into our sophisticated understandings of how institutions work, including scientific institutions, how they relate to other kinds of institutions, and how, above all, we as a global polity increasingly brought together by problems like climate change ought to go forward with respect for, but not undue deference toward, the findings of science in society. So thank you.